Okay, our next speaker is Anne-Marie O'Hagan. Anne-Marie is going to be speaking about analysis of experience with environmental impact assessments from wave energy test centres. Anne-Marie is from University College Cork, and I think this sounds awfully like an output of the Sophia European project.
Stole my thunder, Ian.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Ian, and to all of you for staying here. I'm going to talk briefly about environmental impact assessment experience across some wave energy test sites in Europe, and this is, as Ian said, an output or a result from the Sophia project. The Sophia project was about streamlining ocean wave farm impact assessment. Was obviously too long because I can't remember it or say it. And that title suggests that at the time the project was conceived, we thought there would be farms in the water and we would have loads of data and we could do very thorough analysis of all the environmental monitoring data that would be conducted. Alas, that wasn't exactly the case. The project had 10 partners, or 10 partners from 10 European countries, and those partners worked very closely with 6 European test centres, or test centres located in 6 European countries, which are indicated on the map there. So the Atlantic Marine Energy Test Site, which is still under development off the west coast of Ireland, Wave Hub in Cornwall, Lissachil in Sweden, SEMREV in France, Ocean Plug in Portugal, and BEMEP in the Basque Country. And the whole idea of this project was to look at the unknowns, the environmental and socio-economic impacts of wave farms, the uncertainties around adapting regulatory process to wave energy, and integrated or the potential for more integrated impact assessment policies. So as part of the project, we looked at existing environmental impact assessments from the test centres. And I suppose at this point I should say that for the benefit of the people here from outside of Europe, wave energy developments it's not mandatory for wave energy projects to have environmental impact assessments in Europe. That's at the discretion of the member state. Because of the uncertainties and the unknowns around wave energy, most countries so far have subjected EIA or subjected wave energy to environmental impact assessments. So we had some documents to work with. And we wanted to look at if environmental monitoring and environmental impact assessment as a process was still a barrier for the development of wave energy. To review the monitoring information available and assess what monitoring was in place for different projects, how this monitoring was done. Was it possible to look at the results from different sites and draw any trends or any firm conclusions, and see if any understanding has been gained on some of the environmental effects of wave energy? So, as you're probably aware, environmental impact assessments are quite big documents in Europe. We tried to synthesize that information into a report, and I have a copy here for anybody that's interested. Unfortunately, the report is 100 pages long, so I'm not sure if we fully succeeded in synthesizing the information. To give you an idea of the type of parameters that are looked at across the 6 wave energy sites, you can see the slide is broken down into 3 coloured areas. So you have physical processes or physical parameters, biological parameters, and then the more socioeconomic parameters related to socioeconomics and culture. So I suppose you could say simply that according to different locations, you have different requirements. Different locations have different specificities and demand different environmental impact assessment considerations and associated monitoring. Alternatively, you could say that maybe in Northern Europe we go too far and do everything, and maybe there's a balance to be drawn somewhere. So those are some questions that came up. In terms of the methods utilised, there was quite a degree of correspondence across the different test sites as to the methods used. So just in terms of marine mammals there, you can see a variety of methods were used. The most common was static acoustic monitoring, which I'll come back to later in the talk. For birds, the 3 test centres that measured birds or monitored birds, they also used the same techniques. Fish and shellfish, a bit different, and benthos, again, a variety of techniques across the different locations. And there's much more detailed information on this in the report. In terms of the physical environment, what I want to do is sort of to look at some parameters in particular, and given the audience, that mightn't have been the wisest decision of my life, but anyway, it's too late now. In terms of the physical environment, what I've tried to do is look at the methods that were used in the environmental assessments themselves and the subsequent monitoring that was undertaken, the locations in terms of where at the test sites these different techniques were employed, and then if there was any lessons learned. Because of I suppose, the limitations of the environmental impact assessments, some of that information was supplemented by available guidance. So for wave measurements, I think everybody will know that mirror directional buoys are the most common equipment used. There are also some places which used ADCPs. High frequency radar isn't used as frequently because there are still some uncertainties over the accuracy and reliability of the data. In terms of the monitoring, practice would suggest that it should span 1 to 2 years, obviously because wave energy developers are reliant on this information to an extent. It is likely that it will go on for much longer than that, and should have a minimum temporal resolution of 3 hours. In terms of the locations of the actual buoys themselves, they tend to be upwind of the test berth, and only 2 of the test centres had wave buoys downstream of the berths. So I think that's quite interesting. In terms of current, DCPs were the most common piece of equipment used, but they're depth limited. 1 to 2 months continuous recording seemed to be the trend, but again, this very much depended on the piece of equipment used, and that being limited by battery life and memory. The locations, in a similar way to the wave buoys, they tended to be upstream, but it was desirable to have them both upstream and downstream. And in some places, they tended to be deployed with the wave buoy. So lessons learned, I suppose this is where it gets a bit more sketchy. There's no certainty that wave or tidal farms will impact significantly on wave or current fields to date. There seems to be a lot of major improvements needed to the methods used to answer the question in terms of what impacts the removal of energy will have. And that really relates to the fact that most of this information tends to be based on models, and there's not much validation. Preliminary studies, and this came from the literature review that we conducted, would suggest that changes in significant wave height along shore shouldn't exceed a few percent. The largest effects, as one might think or one might expect, would be experienced immediately downstream. And the combined effects, I suppose, of wave spreading and diffraction on distant shorelines are expected to be quite small. So I suppose overall that's quite positive, but within certain limitations. Noise was the next parameter that I selected to look at. I think we've heard a lot about noise in marine mammals both in the past few days, and as I say, probably weren't wise parameters to choose. We know that there's really no established instrumentation or methodology for noise. There's little data available. One thing that we are seeing in Europe, because of the sort of new focus of noise measurement within the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, this has kind of come into the attention of regulators, and it's becoming a more common requirement as part of the EIA process and as a post-consent monitoring requirement. There is some guidance available on how to measure noise. I've threw in some references there. And the methods really depend on what questions are being asked, and this is something that came up in the marine mammals work as well. Single hydrophone arrays, it really depends on what you want to measure, and that comes back to what you're being asked for within your environmental impact assessment. There was no real consistency across test sites as to the length of deployments, and again that was probably because of the type of equipment that was used. So I've just put up a slide there that kind of summarises the 4 test centres that did actually deal with noise. And I think one of the things that's interesting to note for this is that 2 of those places had to do it as part of their EIA, but in the other two places they didn't, and I think that's really encouraging. In Ireland, and obviously Irish and a bit biased, there's an ongoing project to develop tools to measure noise, and this is going to be coupled with the wave energy device deployment in the near future. I think another interesting thing to note here is that the actual recordings of the noise are quite short. So in one case it was 6 months, in one case it was 39 days. I'm not sure if that's equipment, if it's conditions, what it was. And the third observation I would make on that, and I forgot to mention that as part of Sophia we tried to develop a data management platform where we could put all the available data, that people could search it. The noise data that was collected at the test centres wasn't available for upload, but maybe that will change in the future. So in terms of the lessons learned, I suppose noise studies to date tend to focus on the attempts to measure the acoustic signature of different wave energy converters. Obviously there's more studies required. A big gap area is the fact that we don't have ambient noise measurements, and that's something I think which member states have to look at. I just listed the Swedish example there, which lasted for 39 days, and one of the findings they had was that they could only measure noise in wave heights of less than 500 centimetres or half a metre, and anybody that knows anything about wave energy will know that devices tend to function in wave heights greater than that. Of the noises that the noises that they recorded, they were able to attribute those to an actual fault in the wave energy converter itself. The sounds recorded were below the threshold for physical injury to fish and marine mammals, except harbour seals. But I think the developer there felt that if he corrected the problem with his device, then he wouldn't have an issue with noise. Another encouraging, I suppose, finding from this review was that a number of noise monitoring programs are ongoing, and I think that will contribute to learning. We've already heard in this session that there's definitely been developments on instrumentation for the measurement of different parameters. The guidance that's available from the literature would tend to suggest that long duration noise monitoring should really focus on frequencies and amplitudes and cover all the hearing ranges of different species until more is known, so I think that's a real catch-all. In terms of marine mammals, I really hope they would have run out of time by this to have to do it. Across the test centres, static acoustic monitoring methods are the most commonly used. Again, the technique used really depended on the question to be answered. So at all the test centres, they used boat-based transits, which might give you an indication of what's there and distribution, but it's not really it's not very useful for telling you how mammals interact with devices. So maybe consenting conditions need to be more specific, and I think that came up in the last presentation as well. The report itself looks at how the different methodologies were utilised at the test centre, so there's a bit more information there. I think one of the interesting things to come out of the review as well was that even though we're all very familiar with marine mammals, many test centres seem to lack alternative additional locations away from their berths in which to monitor, and therefore there's limitations with their control locations for statistical purposes. So I'm going to skip this one because the audience definitely know more about this than I can tell them, and I'm just going to go to the summary, which was comprised or conducted by the project team. And I think the good point to take away from this is that most interactions were deemed compatible, and those that were deemed severe, really it just meant that there was stricter monitoring criteria. So I think that's important, that we're not saying it's all bad. In terms of conclusions, I kind of tried to stay away from the more scientific conclusions, and as a lawyer I suppose I'm more concerned about the process and the EIA and if it's fit for purpose. And I know that's something that the European Commission have been working on as well. Probably some of you will know that a new EIA directive has been proposed that will have tighter scoping and screening processes. There was talk about having a clearinghouse mechanism where all EIA data would go and somebody would then almost take responsibility for analysing it. I'm not quite sure if that amendment has actually made it through to the last draft. I'd say some people hope it certainly doesn't. But I think there's still some questions that we haven't answered apart from the scientific side, and that is whether the EIA directive is fit for purpose. And I'm going to leave it at that.